Hi guys, how are you guys doing today? Welcome back to the channel. If you guys don't know who I am, my name is Divyanka and I'm a doctor of pharmacy here in the US. On this channel, I'm striving to provide both you and I with resources to help live our best and most productive life. Alright, so today's video is again a continuation of our deep dive series of the different functional areas within the pharmaceutical industry. I did an overview video of all the different functional areas a PharmD can go into after graduation in the pharmaceutical industry, and that video was mainly an overview. So I wanted to take the time to really do a deep dive into each different functional area. The goal of the deep dive videos then is to really understand what these functional areas do, what their purpose is, who works within these departments, and of course, why one should want to work in that department. Understanding the aspects of these functional areas and what it actually means is super important to then decide if a career in pharma is right for you, and if it is, which functional area is right for you. So in today's video, we are taking a deep dive look into clinical development, another functional area PharmDs can go into after graduation. So the first thing I want to say about clinical development is that it is not R&D. It is not research and development, and I get that a lot. I think people are confused, and generally I see why that is because clinical can kind of span a lot of different things. So I can see how research and development, preclinical can kind of get confusing with clinical, but again, they're very different. So right off the bat, I want to say that clinical development is not R&D. Clinical development is really kind of what I see as the heart of science in a pharma company. And why I say that is because the drug development process is heavily driven by clinical trials. Everything is based on clinical trials, whether the drug gets approved, whether you go on to the next phase of studies, whether the drug actually gets to patients. Again, all of that is dependent on clinical trials. So within clinical development, the department that's responsible for clinical trials, I kind of really see that as the heart of science of a company. Now let's take a step back and like we always do, let's talk about the fellowship market within clinical development. Now, based on the 2020-2021 IPHO fellowship analysis paper, now like every other functional area, the amount of fellowships is increasing every single year. And I would say clinical development specifically is growing for PharmDs. I think this is a space that generally PharmDs were not in before, and a lot more people are getting into clinical development. And so because of that and because of that demand, naturally the amount of fellowships and positions will go up over time. All right, so what is clinical development? It is really, again, the heart of the company that's determining the safety and efficacy of any medications or medical devices, and in general, any treatments, again, intended for human use. So clinical development, again, does span both preclinical and clinical. So with preclinical, you have your in vitro or your test tube studies. And then within preclinical, you still have in vivo studies as well. So those are your studies in animal models. Most of the time that's in mice, but that can be in other animals such as rabbits, dogs, etc. And then of course, on the other side of things, clinical really spans only human use clinical trials. So that spans clinical trials in phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Overall, in clinical development, the whole idea is to, again, understand the pharmacology of the therapeutic, be able to decipher the clinical data. Within clinical development, you're also responsible for, again, running the clinical trials. So in clinical development, you're also responsible for the operational aspects of a clinical study. So really making sure and keeping tabs specifically on all the clinical trial design aspects, all the way from study startup through the execution of these clinical trials, and then of course at study closeout. Clinical development is also responsible for the development and optimization of many clinical documents. These clinical documents include protocols, investigator brochures, any amendments, so protocol amendments, other documents that need amendments and need to be officially put on record, any procedure manuals, any clinical development plans, clinical study reports or CSRs, and then any other informed consent forms. And that's just, again, kind of an overall broad idea. Many more documents go into the slew and under the responsibility of clinical development. And of course, as clinical trials are ongoing, people working within clinical development are required to analyze, collect, are are responsible for reviewing, analyzing, collecting, and reporting, if necessary, any clinical data, again, as the clinical trials are happening. So let's quickly dive into different sub-departments. Within clinical development, again, you'll see kind of the separation between strategy and operations. Again, pretty standard within the industry. You will always kind of see those groups within any functional area or department. Again, it makes total sense, right? You need a team actually planning and strategizing these clinical trials, the development program, etc. And then you need the people who are actually going to be doing it. Okay, so the plan is done, but who's actually executing it? Generally, it's a mix of both teams, but again, that's the purpose of an operations team being there. In terms of the structure of teams within clinical development, sometimes they can be broken up by therapeutic area, again, depending on the company and if it spans more than one therapeutic area, or depending on their products. So again, this is going to depend per company, but for instance, bigger companies that span more therapeutic areas would probably break it down by therapeutic area because that makes sense. And maybe for a company that has more drug products than therapeutic areas, it might make more sense to make teams based on those products. So overall, that's to say that it really depends per company. But again, you'll kind of see the same overall structure from company to company. So who can work in clinical development? Now, I think clinical development is definitely one of those areas where you're going to see people from various backgrounds. Now, I've said this in every video, so of course it's true for many functional areas, but within clinical development specifically, I feel like there's a broader range. This is kind of where you need help in every aspect. So you're going to have the people who are really new to their career that have a bachelor's of science degree or something like that, spanning to, of course, people in higher strategy positions with their MDs, PhDs, and now PharmDs are definitely getting more and more involved within clinical development. So honestly, if you have interest in being in clinical development, you can 100% be there. I would say background-wise, you can kind of start within clinical development as long as you have some sort of a science background. So a bachelor's of science, for instance, or a master's, or of course a PharmD, MD, PhD, all of those things. Of course, in clinical development, you really have to know the science. So I would say here specifically, I wouldn't necessarily see anyone without a scientific background unless they were in a project management type role. So that lends me to talking about the different roles within clinical development. Now, if you're looking for entry-level positions, the way to start within clinical development is definitely as a CRA or a CTA. These are clinical research assistants and clinical trial assistants. They are interchangeable sometimes, but sometimes they're not. More often, CRAs are kind of the ones at the site and CTAs are in-house at the company, but it usually just depends. And again, depending on company, it can be interchangeable. But that is usually the entry-level position of where people start within clinical development. And then, of course, work your way up in terms of trial manager, senior manager, director, goes on as normal. But again, I think the key differentiator here is really the starting point, which is as a CTA or a CRA. And again, you don't really need a higher degree for that. You can have a bachelor's in science or a master's for those roles. That's how people get into pharma within clinical development, with a general science background. And even with a PharmD, if you are to go in without a fellowship, that is generally the route you would probably take. So why would you want to be working in clinical development, specifically as a PharmD? I think this is one of the best places, and I was very surprised when I started looking into this that many PharmDs don't work in clinical development. To me, clinical development is a science center house of a pharma company. And again, their goal is to really understand the pharmacology of the treatment. So it only makes sense to have pharmacists on your team. So if you really like the science, like getting deep into the science, and then being able to translate that, again, directly into analyzing the data that you're getting from these clinical trials, then this is kind of really the space for you. If you want to get head down into the clinical stuff, writing the protocols, writing the CSRs, IBs, etc., all the parts and the clinical aspects that go into the drug development process, if that is something that excites you, then definitely look into clinical development. I personally was interested in clinical development for this specific reason. The next reason is understanding the drug development process and actually being involved in either a phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trial. Again, at any point, whether it's study startup, study closeout, the duration of the study, writing the clinical documents, whatever it is, that experience will always be good. And especially as a foundation, understanding the drug development process is key. Understanding the different aspects, the how-tos that go into the overall process. And if you ever were to move into another role, either within a different department in the pharma company or externally, even going back into clinical practice, practice, etc. Whatever change you want to make, any knowledge of the drug development process will never fail you. That will always be something that adds to your resume, that adds to your experience. So I think it's a great place to again gain foundational knowledge. Now, on the opposite spectrum of things, it's actually great to understand the overall strategy of the drug development process as well. A lot of strategy goes into clinical trial design, making sure that the outcomes we get from that study are going to best reflect what we're actually going after and what the treatment is supposed to prove, right? So again, a lot of strategy goes into that, and being able to speak to that strategy and that science comes with experience. So again, being on kind of the top end in higher positions in clinical development, again, is really, really key and really important and vital to a pharma company. So kind of on both spectrums, like it's a really, really important department. Of course, if you want to be involved in the clinical trials itself, understanding these, again, I was personally interested. So it was kind of a personal goal of mine to be able to have experience in all phases of a study. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And again, having that robust experience can speak volumes. And lastly, a great reason to be in clinical development is because it not only spans the beginning of the drug development process to the end, from phase 1 studies to phase 3 studies, but it's really smack dab in the middle of the whole drug development process. So it's after R&D, it's after preclinical as well, but of course it's before medical affairs gets involved, marketing, post-marketing, all of that stuff. So clinical development really takes the biggest chunk of the drug development process, engulfs it, and all the aspects are within that. So my takeaway from that is if you're working in clinical development, you're going to get the most robust experience overseeing as much of the drug development process as you can, and then you can be able to speak to both the early side of things and the later side of things. Many people are interested in, let's just say, medical affairs, because when you're working in medical affairs, you're only dealing with the drug when the drug is at a phase 3 of its life cycle and after that. But within clinical development, again, you're kind of getting the whole picture, and it's a great place to be involved in terms of the whole process. So overall, I think clinical development, again, is one of the best departments for a PharmD to be in. It's not only understanding the science and the pharmacology, but of course, implementing that rationale and that science into clinical trial study design, into the different clinical documents, etc. I think a PharmD is very well suited for this role, and I think that's why we're seeing more PharmDs infiltrate into clinical development. It's something that was and still is of interest to me, and if anything that I talked about today was kind of intriguing to you in any way, definitely look more into it. I think the biggest pros of working in clinical development is that usually it's a very exciting place to be. Of course, if you're working on a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 study for a drug, for a company, that can be a very exciting time. It could mean the company is growing. It could mean the company might be getting a very exciting approval in the very near or far future, etc. So again, a very exciting space. Of course, you have to have sound scientific knowledge when you're working in clinical development. So it's a great place to really harbor your scientific knowledge, harbor your scientific skills, and then of course be able to implement them in your daily work. You'll definitely stay on top of all of your clinical and scientific skills, learn all the technicalities of it, etc. So a great place to be challenged and grow. And of course, like I mentioned, you are really getting involved in the deep trenches of a clinical trial and the clinical development process. So especially for someone starting out new in the industry, gaining experience, it's a great place to gain foundational knowledge. If pharma is what you want to do and you want to understand the drug development process and be able to speak to that and have experience in it, then clinical development is definitely a place you need to gain some experience in. But overall, I hope that video was helpful for you guys. I hope that gave you a deep enough look into clinical development, what it kind of consists of, and enough for you to then go do more research. As always, don't only take my videos for face value. Please put the information with other research you've done, things you've heard from others in your network, etc. Two last things. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And lastly, if you like the hoodie that I'm wearing, I have this and many other designs on the FocusRx website. The link is down in the description bar below, so feel free to check it out. As always, I hope this video was helpful for you guys. If you guys have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me or comment below. As always, I make it a priority to answer to you guys. That is it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and of course, you guys will see me in the next one.